He just wanted to dismantle a rusty silo for scrap metal. But what was hidden inside changed everything and shocked even the neighbors. Subscribe and write in the comments where you are watching us from. The morning had been gray when Jonathan first drove his battered pickup toward the courthouse. But by the time he stepped out onto the cracked pavement, the clouds were breaking, letting pale sunlight spill down in uneven patches. He clutched a thin envelope under his arm, papers rustling faintly with every movement of his hand. It felt unreal to him, as though the world had conspired to let him hold something he had no business possessing. The envelope contained the deed to a plot of land that no one in town wanted, a piece of earth that had sat abandoned for years, its structures collapsing and its soil choked with weeds. The crown of the land was a hulking grain silo, a rusted giant that rose high above the valley, like a forgotten relic. He had bought the place for nearly nothing, the price so low that it seemed more like a dare than a transaction. Jonathan stood still on the courthouse steps, listening to the murmur of the street around him. A couple of men he recognized from the feed store leaned against a pickup across the road, their arms folded as they stared at him with amused expressions. One of them spat a stream of tobacco into the dust, then shook his head. Jonathan didn't need to hear their words to know what they were thinking. The whole town knew about the sale, and the whole town thought he had lost his mind. For as long as Jonathan could remember, he had lived under the weight of being nobody. His parents had been farm laborers, drifting from place to place depending on where the work was, and he had grown up with the bitter knowledge that permanence was something other people had. When other boys were playing baseball or swimming in the lake, Jonathan was stooped in the fields gathering hay or hauling sacks of feed. The dirt had worked its way into his skin, under his nails, and into the seams of his clothes. His hands even now bore the permanent marks of calluses, reminders that nothing in his life had ever come easily. The town had never welcomed him. At best, they tolerated him, nodding when he walked into the diner, letting him stand at the edge of conversations that were never meant to include him. He was useful when a tractor broke down, when someone needed a back strong enough to lift a beam or a roof patched in the middle of winter. But he was never one of them. He knew it in the way their eyes slid past him, in the way their voices softened when speaking to him, as though addressing someone permanently on the outside. And yet, here he was, clutching papers that proved he owned something of his own. Not much, certainly not land that anyone else would have fought for, but enough. It was his. That thought, that tiny flame of pride, burned stubbornly inside him, even as he imagined the laughter that would spread through town by evening. He drove the long road to the edge of town, where his new property lay. The pickup rattled and groaned as he coaxed it over potholes and ruts, past fields that had long since been surrendered to weeds. When he finally pulled onto the dirt lane that led toward the old farm, his chest tightened. There it was, the ruin that he had bought with the last of his savings. The house was little more than a sagging skeleton, its roof bowed and walls caving inward. A couple of outbuildings leaned precariously, their frames cracked like old bones. And then there was the silo. It towered above everything, a colossal cylinder of corroded steel streaked with rust. Gaping holes punctured its sides where the metal had given way, and jagged edges caught the sunlight like teeth. Grass and weeds had grown thick around its base, climbing up its lower walls until it looked as though the earth itself was trying to swallow it whole. Jonathan cut the engine and sat still for a moment, staring. There was a weight to the place, a sense of abandonment so deep it pressed against his chest. The silence was broken only by the ticking of the cooling engine and the distant caw of a crow. For a moment, doubt seeped in. He imagined himself years from now, bent with failure, the land still barren, the silo still standing as a monument to his foolishness. But then he remembered the look in the clerk's eyes when she stamped the papers, the moment the deed had shifted from county property to his name. No matter what anyone said, the land belonged to him now. That truth steadied him. He stepped out into the grass, his boots sinking slightly into the damp earth. The air smelled of rust and old rain. He walked slowly toward the silo, craning his neck to take in its full height. It looked less like a building and more like a monument left by some long-vanished civilization. He could almost feel its age in the way the wind whispered through the open seams, producing a low hum that vibrated in his chest. He reached out, touched the cool metal, and felt flakes of rust crumble beneath his fingers. The silo didn't belong to the town anymore, didn't belong to the past owners who had let it fall. It was his now, and for reasons he couldn't quite explain, that thought filled him with a stubborn kind of pride. When he returned to town later that day, the smirks and quiet comments followed him. At the diner, a man laughed loudly as Jonathan walked past, saying something about fools and their rust buckets. Another shook his head in mock sympathy. Jonathan ignored them, but their words clung to him. He sat alone at a corner table, stirring weak coffee, pretending not to hear. Deep down, though, he knew that every insult only hardened his resolve. He had spent his entire life being the object of other people's pity or derision. This time, he would prove them wrong. That night, lying in the small rented room he still called home, Jonathan stared at the ceiling and thought about the land. He pictured the overgrown fields cut clean, the house rebuilt, the barn standing straight again. And though the image of the silo rose again in his mind, towering, rusted, and ominous, he forced himself to see it not as a burden, but as a challenge, a test. He had bought more than land. He had bought a chance to reshape his own story. The laughter of the townsfolk might echo in his ears for years to come, but when he closed his eyes, he felt the faint pulse of determination beating stronger than their scorn. Jonathan drifted into uneasy sleep with the papers tucked under his pillow. They were fragile, easily torn, but they carried the weight of something he had dreamed about his entire life. Tomorrow the real work would begin. Tomorrow he would set foot on that neglected ground, not as a laborer or an outsider, but as an owner. The thought brought a faint smile to his lips as the darkness closed in. The following morning, Jonathan rose before the sun and stood for a long moment staring at the crumpled papers on his kitchen table. The deed was already beginning to curl at the edges where his hands had held it too tightly, but the black letters across the page still told the same story. The land was his. The thought was both thrilling and terrifying. He drank his coffee quickly, the bitter liquid burning his tongue, then pulled on his oldest work clothes and drove back toward the edge of town, where his future waited among weeds and ruins. When he turned off the main road and followed the rutted lane, the property looked different than it had the day before. In the pale light of early morning, the broken house and sagging outbuildings seemed less like a ruin and more like a battlefield after defeat. The tall grass shivered in the wind like a sea of whispers, and the silo rose once more against the horizon, an immense shadow that claimed the sky. He parked the truck by the collapsed fence and sat for a while, the engine ticking as it cooled, then stepped out with a shovel in one hand and a coil of rope in the other. The first days blurred into each other in a rhythm of sweat and exhaustion. Jonathan began with the obvious, the yard closest to the house. Old boards and rusted nails littered the ground, threatening to pierce his boots. He hauled them into a pile, feeling each plank tear at his hands, even through his gloves. The house itself leaned to one side as though ready to collapse with the next strong wind. He nailed temporary boards across the windows to keep the worst of the weather out, though he doubted the place would ever be truly safe to live in. Still, he found comfort in the act of preservation, however small. Each nail driven into the rotting frame felt like a statement. This land was not finished, not yet. Clearing the overgrowth was harder. Grass rose to his waist and thorn bushes wrapped themselves around fence posts like barbed wire. He swung his borrowed scythe until his shoulders burned and his back felt ready to split. The mower he'd borrowed from a neighbor coughed and rattled but managed to carve rough paths through the thickets. He worked until sweat poured from his face and his arms trembled, then forced himself to keep going, blade after blade of grass falling to his determination. Each evening he left behind wide swaths of bare earth where once there had been only wildness. It was slow work, but it gave him a sense of progress, a sense that he was peeling away the years of neglect to reveal something worth saving underneath. Everywhere he looked, traces of the past revealed themselves. Beneath a collapsed shed, he uncovered an old wagon wheel, its wood rotted, but its iron rim still intact. In a pile of leaves, he found a child's toy car, faded blue plastic, chipped and broken, but still recognizable. There were bottles buried in the soil, some cracked, others whole, their glass catching the light like forgotten jewels. Each object carried with it a whisper of the lives that had once filled this land, people who had worked, laughed, and suffered here before vanishing into memory. Jonathan gathered the items carefully, setting them in a box in the back of his truck. They were worthless in money, but to him they were proof that the land was not empty, that it still carried the stories of those who had come before, and always, there was the silo. No matter what task he set himself to, his eyes were drawn again and again to the towering cylinder of rust. In the midday sun it looked harsh and menacing, the jagged gaps in its walls like wounds. In the evening it loomed like a silhouette against the fading sky, its shadow stretching long across the ground until it seemed to swallow the fields whole. At night, when Jonathan lay exhausted on his cot in the rented room back in town, he found himself thinking of it, hearing in his imagination the hollow groans of metal shifting in the dark. It wasn't only the size of it that unsettled him, but the way it seemed alive. When the wind blew through its broken seams, the sound was not simply noise, but a low, resonant hum that vibrated in his chest. Sometimes he thought it sounded like words spoken in a language too old to understand, carried out across the fields to settle in his bones. He told himself it was foolishness, that it was only rusted steel singing to the wind, but the feeling lingered all the same. The townsfolk continued to watch him with curiosity. When he drove into the hardware store to buy nails and heavy-duty gloves, the clerk raised his eyebrows and asked if he planned on living out there among the ruins. At the diner, whispers followed him when he walked in, conversations that fell silent until he had passed. Some laughed openly, betting on how long he would last before giving up. Others merely shook their heads with pity, convinced they were watching a man dig his own grave one shovel of dirt at a time. Jonathan ignored them as best he could, but in the quiet of the fields their words returned to him. He forced himself to keep working, each swing of the scythe or push of the mower a rebuttal to their scorn. Slowly the land began to change under his efforts. Where once the grass had grown wild and choking, now there were patches of bare soil ready to breathe again. The outlines of an old path revealed themselves, stones half buried leading toward the house. He found remnants of a garden, faint rows where vegetables had once grown, now waiting for someone to bring them back to life. As the weeks passed, he began to feel something new stirring within him. The land was no longer just a ruin he had purchased. It was becoming a reflection of his will. The harder he worked, the more it yielded. Each day left him more exhausted, but also more certain that he had made the right choice. For the first time in his life, he was shaping something of his own, something that would bear his mark. And yet, beneath all of this progress, the silo remained. It stood untouched, a giant that refused to be ignored. He told himself he would deal with it later, once the fields were cleared and the house made livable. But in truth, he knew he was putting it off, because the thought of confronting it filled him with unease. It was too large, too silent, too present. When he walked near it, the air seemed colder, the ground firmer under his boots. When he touched its metal skin, the rust came away on his fingertips like dried blood. He sometimes imagined that it was watching him, waiting for him to make the first move. At night, the thought of it followed him into sleep. He dreamed of standing at its base, looking up into endless darkness, the walls stretching higher than any building he had ever seen. He dreamed of doors hidden in its sides, doors that led not to grain, but to staircases descending into the earth. He woke with sweat on his skin and the echo of hollow metal ringing in his ears. Still, each morning he returned. He could not allow fear to dictate his work. The land was his, and everything on it belonged to him, silo included. He would not let the laughter of the town or the shadow of a rusted monument undo his determination. For now he worked around it, clearing the land and rebuilding what could be saved. But deep inside, he knew the day was coming when he would have to face the silo directly. It was the heart of the farm, the center around which everything else revolved, and it would not let him ignore it forever. One evening, after a long day of cutting thorn bushes and hauling debris, Jonathan stood at the edge of the field and looked out at the land he had reclaimed. The sun was setting behind the silo, painting the sky with fire. The rusted metal glowed in the fading light, its scars highlighted as though the day itself was reminding him of the work yet undone. Jonathan leaned on his shovel and let the silence settle around him. He felt weary to the bone, but beneath the exhaustion was a strange calm. The land was no longer a stranger to him. It was beginning to feel like his own. And yet, as the shadows deepened and the hum of the wind through the silo grew louder, he knew that the true test still waited. The fields and the house were only the beginning. The silo, looming and unyielding, would demand its due. By the third week, Jonathan's body had adjusted to the rhythm of the land, though it did not make the labor easier. His muscles ached constantly, his palms were raw beneath the calluses, and his sleep was a shallow cycle of drifting into dreams, only to wake with the rooster's cry still hours before dawn. Yet something inside him had shifted. Where once he had looked at the property and seen only ruin, now he saw the faint outlines of possibility. The fields no longer felt like wilderness, but like land waiting to breathe again. The house, patched clumsily with boards, still leaned, but at least the wind no longer blew freely through its broken windows. For the first time in years, Jonathan began to feel that he was not just surviving, but shaping a future. But shaping a future required more than sweat and stubbornness. It required money, and that was something he had almost none of. The last of his savings had gone into the purchase of the land, and the steady expenses of tools, nails, fuel, and food were eating away at what little he had left. At night he counted the bills in his wallet and felt the walls close in. He would not be able to continue at this pace without finding some way to bring in extra cash. His eyes always returned to the silo. The giant stood untouched, a column of rust and shadow that loomed over his every effort. In town, people called it a death trap, certain it would collapse sooner rather than later. They told stories of children who had wandered too close and come away with rust stains on their hands, of birds that nested inside and never returned. To Jonathan, it was more than a nuisance. It was a symbol of how the world saw him. Everyone believed it would crush him eventually, just as they believed the land itself would defeat him. One evening, as he sat on the hood of his truck, staring at the silo against the bleeding sky, the answer came to him. The structure was worthless as it stood, but rusted steel still had value. If he dismantled it piece by piece, sold the metal for scrap, he might buy himself the time and supplies needed to keep moving forward. The thought of tearing it down filled him with both relief and unease. Relief because it would mean ridding himself of the shadow that seemed to dominate the land. Unease because there was something about the silo that felt larger than its rusted skin, something that resisted the thought of being destroyed. He tried to ignore that unease. The following morning, he drove into town and bought a heavier crowbar, a new set of gloves, and a cutting torch. The clerk behind the counter raised an eyebrow, but said nothing, though his eyes lingered with a question Jonathan could almost hear. On the way out, he overheard two men whispering to each other about that fool who's going to cut the silo apart and bury himself with it. Jonathan kept his head down and walked on, but the words settled like stones in his chest. Back at the farm, he studied the silo more carefully. Up close, it was even more imposing than it seemed from a distance. The walls stretched skyward in great sheets of corroded steel, patched with shadows and holes. The seams where the panels met were thick with rust, but the structure still seemed unnervingly solid, as if it had been built to withstand more than grain and weather. Jonathan walked around its circumference slowly, noting the places where the metal had thinned, the spots where bolts jutted loose, the edges where he might begin his work. Every step echoed with the hollow sound of his boots against the ground, and every gust of wind made the silo groan, with a voice that carried through his bones. On the first day of work, he struck the steel with his crowbar. The sound reverberated like a bell tolling, deep and resonant, sending a vibration up his arms. The noise rolled across the field and lingered, as though the silo were not merely an object but an instrument that had been waiting to be played. Jonathan stepped back, breath caught in his throat, then forced himself forward again. He wedged the crowbar into a seam and heaved, muscles straining as flakes of rust rained down. At last, with a shriek of protesting metal, one of the panels shifted. A section near the base gave way, revealing a narrow gap into the darkness inside. The smell hit him first, a mixture of mildew, old grain, and something else, something deeper and earthier, like damp soil sealed too long. Jonathan pulled his lantern from the truck and crouched to shine the light through the gap. The beam pierced the gloom, cutting across a floor littered with the remains of rotting corn and broken wood. Dust swirled in the air, disturbed by the first breath of wind the silo had inhaled in years. At first glance, it was exactly what he expected: emptiness and decay. But then, as the light swept across the floor, he saw its shapes that did not belong to ruin. Wooden boxes stacked clumsily against one wall, their edges dark with age. A tarp slumped in a heap nearby, its fabric stiff but intact. And beyond that, half hidden under years of refuse, something that gleamed faintly, catching the lantern's light like a secret refusing to stay buried. Jonathan froze. For a moment he considered stepping back, sealing the gap, pretending he had seen nothing. A sensible man might have done so, leaving whatever was inside to rot in peace. But Jonathan had not fought this hard, had not spent his last savings and endured the town's laughter, only to turn away from the unknown. He pressed closer, his breath shallow, his hand gripping the crowbar so tightly his knuckles whitened. The air seeping from the opening felt cooler than the air outside, carrying with it a whisper of something untouched, something preserved. The discovery unsettled him more than he could admit. He had expected ruin, emptiness, the hollow carcass of a structure long dead. What he found instead was purpose. Someone had used the silo for more than grain. Someone had left things inside deliberately, hiding them away from the world. And now, by chance or fate, he had uncovered their secret. As the sun dipped below the horizon and the fields darkened around him, Jonathan replaced the panel he had loosened and stood staring at the towering cylinder. His pulse was still hammering, his palms slick with sweat despite the evening chill. He had come to dismantle the silo for scrap, to reduce it to nothing more than piles of steel and bolts. But the moment he glimpsed the hidden shapes inside, he knew that nothing about this structure was simple. The metal giant was not just a burden or a monument, it was a vault, a keeper of secrets waiting to be revealed. That night, back in his room, he lay awake listening to the groan of the wind against the window pane. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the faint gleam within the silo, the outline of wooden boxes buried in shadow. He imagined what might be inside, tools perhaps, or supplies left behind by the previous owners. Or maybe something more, something that explained why the structure had been left to rust rather than torn down years ago. The possibilities turned over in his mind until sleep finally claimed him. When he rose again before dawn, there was no longer any question in his mind. The silo could not be ignored or dismantled without understanding what it held. Whatever secrets lay inside, they now belonged to him. And whether they brought fortune or ruin, he knew he would face them. The morning after Jonathan first pried open the silo's skin, he felt a restlessness that drove him from his cot before the sky had even begun to pale. He drank his coffee in silence, staring at the rough scars on his hands where rust and steel had bitten into his skin. The memory of the previous evening returned to him in fragments. The screech of metal yielding, the stench of rot and mildew, the faint glimmer of something not yet consumed by decay. Those glimpses had unsettled him, not because they were terrifying, but because they carried a weight of intent. Someone had placed those boxes there with purpose, had covered them carefully and sealed them away as though they were not meant to be found. He could no longer look at the silo as a carcass of steel. It was something more, a vault or a monument, a silence that carried history within its walls. He drove out to the land with his lantern and crowbar rattling in the back of the truck. The fields looked gray and lifeless in the dim light, mist clinging low as though the earth itself wished to hide what lay beneath. The silo loomed as always, but now it seemed different, less indifferent than before, as though aware that its secrets were no longer fully its own. Jonathan approached it slowly, boots crunching against gravel and broken stalks, his eyes fixed on the seam where he had pried loose the panel. His hands shook as he forced the crowbar back into place and wedged the panel free once more. The gap yawned open like a wound, exhaling the same damp, earthy breath he had smelled before. This time he did not hesitate. He slipped through the opening, lantern held high, and stepped into the cavernous interior. Dust motes swirled like ash in the beam of light, settling on the rotten heaps of grain that had long since fused into solid mounds. The floor creaked beneath his boots, echoing in the hollow chamber, but it held. Against the far wall, half swallowed by shadow, were the shapes he had seen before, Wooden boxes, some stacked, others toppled, their edges softened by years but still intact. He crossed the distance slowly, each step cautious, until he knelt before the nearest one. The wood crumbled under his fingers, but when he pried at the lid, it came free with a groan. Inside lay objects wrapped in oilcloth, their outlines strange against the lantern light. He pulled one free, the fabric stiff with age, and unwrapped it carefully. The smell of mildew burst out, sharp and bitter, but beneath it lay something startling. A military helmet, its paint faded to dull green, a faint insignia still visible on its side. Jonathan turned it over in his hands, running his thumb across the dent in its crown, imagining the head it might once have protected. Beneath it were more, stacked like forgotten soldiers waiting to be summoned again. Another box revealed rifles, their wood swollen and cracked, but the barrels still heavy and cold. Ammunition tins sat nearby, their seals rusted but their labels clear. In yet another he found bundles of papers tied with twine, the pages yellowed and warped. He held them close to the lantern and could just make out government stamps, dates scrawled in fading ink, signatures of men long dead, letters, official documents, reports, all of them hidden here, preserved in this unlikely tomb. Jonathan felt a chill crawl along his spine. This was not the forgotten debris of farm life. This was deliberate, a collection stored with care and secrecy. The silo had not been abandoned to time. It had been used as a vault, a place to hide what was never meant to be found. He leafed through a bundle of papers and read fragments of words. Shipment, confiscated, property retained. But the ink had bled so badly that the sentences dissolved before they reached his understanding. Still, the impression was unmistakable. Whoever had owned this farm had been involved in something far beyond plowing fields and harvesting corn. The lantern's glow flickered, and he lifted it higher, sweeping the beam across the chamber. More boxes waited, some collapsed into piles of splinters, others intact. Tools lay scattered in heaps, wrenches, bolts, coils of wire, their metal blackened but recognizable, and there, beneath a rotting tarp, something larger crouched. He tugged the fabric free and found the skeletal frame of an engine, its parts scattered across the ground like bones. Nearby were wheels, leather saddles cracked and curling, fragments of chains. Recognition dawned on him slowly. These were motorcycles, or what had once been motorcycles, dismantled and abandoned here as though waiting for hands that never returned. He stood among the relics, the silence pressing against him. His heart pounded with a mix of awe and unease. What sort of man had built this hoard beneath the cover of a grain silo? Was he a collector, unable to let go of the past? A smuggler hiding his contraband away from the eyes of the law? Or simply a man who feared the world so much that he buried his life's possessions in steel walls? Jonathan could not know, but the thought that he now held that man's secrets filled him with both triumph and dread. The hours slipped by unnoticed as he moved from box to box, cataloging each new discovery. He found tools arranged with obsessive precision, jars of bolts sorted by size, bundles of wire coiled neatly. He uncovered crates of old photographs sealed in waxed paper, their images blurred by moisture but still showing faces and machines, men grinning beside their engines as though they had conquered the world. He even found a chest tucked against the far wall, its lid swollen shut. With a grunt and a pry from the crowbar, it gave way and inside lay a leather-bound book. The cover was cracked, the pages curled and mold-stained, but the handwriting within was still legible. Jonathan's breath caught as he opened the first page and read the name scrawled there. It was a name he recognized from town gossip, the family that had once owned this farm, whispered about but never truly spoken of. The words on the page were uneven, sometimes clipped to a single line, other times sprawling across whole sheets. He read of trades made in shadows, of dealerships that had gone under, their inventory scooped up quietly, of engines bought by the dozen and stored where no one could see. Pride threaded through the words, but so too did paranoia. Neighbors asking questions, men visiting by night, the constant need to keep everything hidden, safe, untouched. Jonathan sat on the damp ground with the diary open in his lap, the lantern casting long shadows across the chamber. The words on the page felt like whispers from another time. not merely recounting events but demanding to be heard. He realized with a sudden weight that he had not only uncovered objects but inherited a legacy. This was not treasure to be sold for scrap. It was history, tangled in secret, bound to the land he now called his own. When at last he climbed back out of the silo, the daylight felt too bright, the air too thin. He replaced the panel carefully, as though trying to reseal the silence he had broken. But he knew it was impossible. The silo's secrets were no longer hidden. They lived in his mind now, pressed into his chest with every heartbeat. He loaded the diary into the cab of his truck and sat with his hands on the wheel, staring at the towering shape before him. The laughter of the townsfolk echoed faintly in his memory, but it seemed far away now. They thought him a fool for buying a ruin. They could never guess what that ruin had chosen to reveal. That night, the diary lay open on his kitchen table, its pages illuminated by a single lamp. Jonathan read deep into the hours, his eyes burning, the words seeping into him until he could no longer tell where the old owner's obsession ended and his own curiosity began. Outside, the wind rose, rattling the windows, and he thought of the silo standing in the dark, patient and silent, its secrets bleeding slowly into his life. He closed the book abruptly and leaned back in his chair, but the silence that followed was not peace. It was a weight, a question pressing closer with every hour. He had come to this land to find independence, to build a future of his own. Instead, he had found a past that demanded his attention, a past that had been hidden for decades beneath steel and shadow. Whether he liked it or not, the land had given him more than ownership. It had given him responsibility, and he knew with a certainty that chilled him that his life would never again be the same. The days that followed Jonathan's discovery were restless ones. He could not look at the silo without feeling the pull of what lay within, as though the relics hidden behind its walls were calling out to him. Each morning he returned to the farm, his tools clattering in the bed of the truck, his lantern swinging from his hand, and each evening he left with more fragments of a story that seemed impossible to piece together fully. The diary never left his side. He read it at night by the dim glow of a lamp, turning the pages with hands that trembled between awe and unease. The voice of the man who had once lived here echoed in his mind, proud, obsessive, terrified, as though time itself had chosen Jonathan to become the unwilling witness to a secret life. But as his fascination deepened, so too did the feeling that he was not alone in his interest. At first it was subtle, a pickup truck slowing as it passed on the road, the driver craning his neck for a longer look than seemed casual, a neighbor's boy lingering by the fence longer than necessary, eyes wide as though hoping to catch sight of something unusual. Jonathan told himself it was nothing. The townsfolk had laughed at him for weeks, and now curiosity was only natural. But then came the evening when, wiping the sweat from his brow after hours of hauling debris, he noticed two figures standing at the far edge of the field. They were motionless against the dying light, silhouettes without faces, and though he raised his hand in acknowledgement, they made no gesture in return. By the time he took a step toward them, they had slipped away into the tall grass without a sound. Sleep became harder to find. Jonathan lay awake in the darkness, listening to the creaks of his rented house as though they were footsteps. He dreamed of men slipping into the silo by night, prying open the panels he had forced loose, stealing away with the diary and the relics before he could even wake. More than once he rose in the small hours, dressed, and drove out to the property just to be certain everything was as he had left it. Each time he found the silo standing silent, the boards he had replaced undisturbed, but the sense of being watched never left him. Inside the silo, the discoveries grew stranger. Beyond the crates of helmets and rifles, beyond the engine parts and tools, he uncovered a smaller chamber concealed behind a wall of debris. It was narrow, low-ceilinged, forcing him to duck as he entered. Here the objects were different. Boxes of papers sealed in wax, folders bound with leather straps, and beneath them envelopes fat with cash, so brittle it cracked when he touched it. Among these were more personal artifacts, a bundle of letters written in a hurried hand, photographs of men standing beside vehicles, their faces stern, unsmiling. Each piece told the same story as the diary. This farm had been more than a home. It had been a sanctuary for dealings that did not bear the scrutiny of daylight. Jonathan carried the items carefully to the surface, loading them into the back of his truck one by one. He told himself it was only to keep them safe from damp and rot, but part of him knew he no longer trusted the silo to keep its silence. With each artifact he moved, the place seemed emptier, yet heavier, as though the walls themselves disapproved of his theft. The air inside grew colder, the echoes sharper, until he could not shake the thought that the building was watching, waiting for him to falter. His thoughts grew tangled. What was he to do with these discoveries? He imagined walking into town with the diary and photographs, showing them to the historical society, perhaps even to the police. They would take the relics from him, study them, argue over their value, and what then? Would they leave him with nothing but rust and weeds, stripping from him the only thing that had ever felt like his own? Or worse, would they accuse him of theft, of meddling in matters that were never meant to surface? The notion made his chest tighten. He was not just a farmer anymore. He was a keeper of something he could neither explain nor surrender. One evening, as he locked the truck after a long day, he noticed fresh tracks in the dirt near the fence line. They were not his own, nor the marks of any animal he knew. Footprints. He crouched, tracing them with a trembling finger, and felt the hairs rise on the back of his neck. Someone had been here, circling the property, watching. The memory of the two figures returned with sudden clarity, and he realized that the town's laughter had shifted into something more dangerous. Envy, suspicion, hunger. The air grew heavy in those days, the sky darkening with a tension that seemed to mirror his own. Storm clouds gathered on the horizon, low and bruised, carrying with them the promise of rain. By the time the first drops spattered against the windows of his truck, Jonathan knew the storm would be fierce. He tried to tell himself he could ride it out, that the silo had withstood decades of wind and weather and would endure a little longer. But a gnawing dread would not let him rest. The structure was old, rusted through in places, its seams weakened by years of neglect. What if the storm was the one to finally claim it? And what of the relics still inside? He did not wait for morning. As the wind howled across the fields and branches lashed against the hood of his truck, Jonathan drove out to the farm. Lightning split the sky above him, illuminating the silo in stark flashes of white. It looked less like a building and more like a shipwreck stranded on land, its sides groaning as the storm pressed against them. Rain hammered the roof of the truck, soaking him as soon as he stepped outside. The ground was slick beneath his boots, mud sucking at every step, but he pushed forward, driven by a single thought. If he left the relics to the storm, they would be lost forever. The doors of the silo shuddered when he forced them open, the wind nearly tearing them from his grasp. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of wet metal and decay. Water poured through cracks in the roof, dripping down the walls in shining rivulets, pooling on the floor until it glistened under the swing of his lantern. The groan of the storm outside mingled with the moan of the structure itself. Beams shifting, bolts straining, the whole place alive with complaint. Jonathan wasted no time. He tore back the boards covering the hidden chamber and began hauling out what he could. The diary was first, then the bundles of letters, the photographs sealed in their fragile envelopes. He dragged a chest of tools toward the stairs, muscles screaming as the weight threatened to pull him down. Above him, thunder cracked so loud it shook the floor, dust raining from the beams. He imagined the roof collapsing, burying him alive beneath decades of rust. Still he pressed on, carrying armful after armful to the truck, staggering through sheets of rain until the bed was half filled with salvaged history. Each trip back inside felt more perilous than the last. A beam split with a sound like a gunshot, crashing to the ground only feet from where he stood. The floor sagged ominously under his weight, water seeping up through the cracks. He knew he was running out of time. At last, his strength nearly gone, he seized one final bundle wrapped in cloth and stumbled toward the door. As he emerged into the storm, lightning tore across the sky, bathing the silo in a blaze of white. For a heartbeat it looked whole again, magnificent, its rusted sides gleaming as though alive. Then the thunder rolled and the vision shattered. With a groan that seemed almost like a sigh, the silo gave way. The roof bowed inward, then collapsed, sending a cascade of steel and wood tumbling into the hollow interior. Sparks flared briefly where metal scraped against hidden wires, and then it was over. The giant lay broken, a ruin swallowed by rain. Jonathan stood in the downpour, his chest heaving, his arms cradling the final bundle. His truck bed brimmed with what little he had managed to save: the diary, the photographs, the letters, the tools, fragments of engines. Behind him, the storm claimed the rest, drowning decades of secrets in mud and debris. He felt no triumph, only exhaustion, and a strange certainty that something greater than himself had been decided that night. When dawn came, the storm broke, leaving the sky washed pale and clean. Steam rose from the wreckage as the sun touched it, the twisted steel gleaming faintly as though mocking him. Jonathan sat on the tailgate of his truck, soaked to the bone, and looked out at what remained. The land was changed forever. The silo, once a monument to secrecy, was gone, but the weight of its legacy pressed heavier than ever. He had saved fragments, but more importantly, he had been chosen as their keeper. The laughter of the town no longer mattered. The storm had tested him, and though it had nearly buried him, he had endured. And as he stared at the ruin, the diary safe beside him, Jonathan understood that the land had given him not just ownership, but responsibility. He was no longer the man who had bought a ruin for pennies. He was the man who carried its story forward, whether he wished to or not. The morning after the storm, Jonathan stood before the wreckage of the silo, the mud sucking at his boots as he moved slowly around the twisted mass of steel and splintered wood. The once towering structure was now nothing more than a heap of rusted bones, its silence replaced by the occasional groan of metal settling deeper into the earth. The storm had been merciless, stripping the land of its illusions and reducing what had stood for decades to ruin in the space of a single night. He should have felt defeated, but instead he felt strangely calm. He had been tested, and though the storm had taken much from him, it had left him with enough. In the back of his truck, covered with a tarp, lay the fragments he had rescued: the diary, the boxes of papers, the photographs, the scattered tools and parts that the water had not yet claimed. They were only pieces compared to the whole that had been lost, but they were more than nothing. They were proof that the secrets buried in the silo had not vanished entirely. In the days that followed, the townsfolk came to see the aftermath. Trucks slowed as they passed on the road, drivers leaning out their windows to shake their heads or laugh at the sight of the ruin. Some stopped to speak with Jonathan, their words dripping with false sympathy, their eyes darting to the tarp in the back of his truck. He gave them little to hold on to. He told them only that the storm had taken what was bound to fall sooner or later, nothing more. Let them gossip, let them speculate. The truth was his alone to carry, and he felt no need to share it with those who had mocked him from the beginning. He rented a small shed on the outskirts of town, a space no larger than a single room, but dry and secure enough for what he needed. There, with quiet reverence, he arranged the salvaged relics. The diary lay open on a table, its pages carefully dried and pressed flat. The photographs were spread in neat rows, their images blurred but still holding glimpses of faces in places long gone. The tools and engine parts rested along the walls, stacked as though waiting for hands that might one day restore them. In that shed, Jonathan found something he had not expected: a sense of purpose. What had begun as desperation to own a piece of land, to prove himself against the laughter of others, had transformed into something larger. He was no longer just a farmer struggling to build a life from ruin. He was the guardian of a story, the keeper of a legacy that had chosen him through chance and persistence. At night, when the wind rose and rattled the walls of his rented house, he would sit at the table with the diary spread open, reading the words of the man who had come before him. The handwriting told the story of a life consumed by collection and secrecy, of trades made in shadows, of a fear of losing what had been gathered. Jonathan felt the weight of that obsession pressing at him, threatening to seep into his own bones. But unlike the man before him, he did not feel the urge to hoard in silence. He felt instead a responsibility to preserve, to honor, to ensure that what had been hidden in darkness would not be lost again. When he returned to the farm, the absence of the silo left a strange emptiness in the sky. The land seemed smaller without it, less burdened, but also lonelier. He walked among the weeds that had already begun to reclaim the broken beams and panels, and in his mind he imagined something new rising there. Not another silo, not a monument to secrecy, but a place of memory, a building that might one day hold the relics in the open light, a place where others could come to see the history that had been left to rot. The thought stirred in him with surprising strength, giving shape to a vision he had never dared before. The town continued to whisper, but their laughter no longer pierced him. He had survived their mockery, survived the storm, and survived the collapse of the very thing they had said would crush him. In its fall, the silo had remade him. He was no longer the man who had bought a ruin for pennies, no longer the outsider defined by the pity of others. He was the man who had unearthed a story hidden in steel, who had carried fragments of the past through wind and rain, and who now bore the weight of ensuring it endured. One evening, as the sun sank low and painted the sky in hues of fire, Jonathan stood on the field where the silo had once cast its shadow. The wreckage was already sinking into the earth, the weeds rising defiantly through the twisted metal. He felt the cool weight of the diary in his hands, the leather cracked but strong, its pages whispering with the voice of the man who had come before. For the first time in years, Jonathan felt peace. The storm had stripped away everything fragile, leaving only what mattered, the strength to endure, the will to preserve, and the knowledge that he had become part of a story larger than himself. He lifted his eyes to the horizon, the land stretching out before him, and saw not ruin but promise. The laughter of the townsfolk faded into nothing, carried away by the evening wind. This place, broken and battered as it was, belonged to him, and in the quiet glow of fading light, Jonathan understood that he had not merely inherited land or relics. He had inherited a destiny. If this story kept you hooked, make sure you hit that subscribe button so you never miss the next unbelievable twist. Want more shocking discoveries? Watch the next video right here and dive even deeper into the secrets people never expected to find. And don't keep this to yourself. Share this video with your friends so they can experience it too.